Theology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and in the first half hour here, we're going to get into a couple of issues in the news, and then we'll be talking with our good friend George Barna. Churchgoers are tipping towards socialism. No, you can't make this one up. Of course, it's part of a larger discussion we're going to have with him about on many different issues. You are seeing that people that are regular churchgoers are really straying from biblical orthodoxy and even what you might consider to be political orthodoxy. I recognize that we get ourselves in trouble all the time by talking about the fact that some of these ideas that are in the Bible also have political implications, but they do, and I think it is important to get into that issue as well. So we'll be talking about that with him in this hour, at the bottom part of this hour. Next hour, we'll have Michael Johnson with us, and he is, of course, with the Slavic Gospel Association. We've had him on from time to time to talk about what's going on in Ukraine. And if you think this is a difficult time for you, just imagine what it's like for, again, many of the Christians and churchgoers there in Ukraine. So we're going to talk about how we can pray for them, what we can do to help them, and then, of course, get back into some other issues in the news, which we have covered. One, especially on immigration, we're going to talk about a very good piece by Victor Davis Hanson, which is helping us understand that not only has illegal immigration caused all sorts of problems in the fact that you have individuals roaming the streets who shouldn't be here in the first place, and you've had the issue of deportations and on, it also is now affecting the issue of legal immigration and a pushback there as well. So these are what we oftentimes refer to as the unintended consequences of a policy. In the case of the Biden administration, maybe a lack of policy has to do with the issue of the border that has created that situation. One of the things I want to lead with is a conversation that we had on Friday, but now a very good piece by the editors of National Review. You might remember that we did post an article on Friday which was about this particular case before the Supreme Court having to do with Donald Trump and whether or not he has the right to fire an individual that is part of what's called an independent agency. That would be the Federal Trade Commission. And so the oral arguments were heard on Monday, Trump versus Slaughter. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I think it brings us back to a very important question that we've talked about here on the program. I'll hold up the booklet we did quite a while ago on a biblical view on what is it called? The deep state. And so when we talk about the deep state, we talk about the administrative state. There are individuals that are serving there at the pleasure of the president and certainly provide research and information for Congress. And again, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but it is, I think, very true. And almost everybody's recognized that some of these people in the bureaucracy will be there longer than even a president who is there for 8 years. Sometimes they're even longer than a member of Congress. And so they tend to be very independent in a bad sense of the word, and sometimes will do all they can to undermine the agenda of the sitting president of Congress and even direct statements which are made in the law. So that's an issue. And even though you may not have read the Deep State booklet, I might hold up this one again because it's just come out. It's the December booklet we set out, and it's based on the book The Road to Serfdom. And it's my attempt to take a book that I think a lot of people need to know about, but probably will never have a chance to read, and summarize it. And that's where author Friedrich Hayek spends a fair amount of time talking about socialism, so I'll come back to that again when we talk with our friend George Barna, but also points out that people that like to control other people oftentimes tend to gravitate to something like the bureaucracy, and as a result, they certainly enjoy writing laws even when they're supposed to be executing the laws, and that's really what's front and center right now in front of Congress and in front and center in front of the Supreme Court. Because the argument that they make is very clear that we've had this idea of the separation of powers. The legislative branch, Congress, writes the laws. The executive branch executes those laws. And yet they point out that there's been a lot of, if you will, constitutional mischief that has arisen. And a great deal of it, they rightly point out, comes from Woodrow Wilson and then some others, certainly from Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And so we had this creation of so-called independent agencies, which exercises, they said, executive power outside of executive control and accountability. If you read your Constitution, and I would recommend that you do so, Article 2 talks about the fact that the president should exercise what? The executive power of the United States. And that is vested in him in Article 2 of the Constitution. And the editors rightly ask if he cannot fire people who exercise executive power in ways opposed to his policies, then how powerful is the president? What's so interesting is you had a little bit of a back and forth in that regard as well, in which as you had those who were trying to argue against what Donald Trump is doing actually found themselves arguing that, you know, the president really doesn't have all the powers. The individual that was arguing this was asked by Justice Neil Gorsuch, does the president have a duty to faithfully execute all the laws? And the answer was, I would say no. And so again, if the president cannot exercise all the laws, who will? And so you have a little bit of a back and forth where Justice Elena Kagan said that some of these so-called independent agencies, they're not just executive agencies, they're also doing a lot of legislating and they're doing a lot of judging. And so that's where you have, again, Justice Neil Gorsuch said, well, maybe the answer perhaps is to recognize that Congress cannot delegate its legislative authority. Anyway, the bottom line is this goes all the way back to what's called Humphrey's executor. This was a case going all the way back to FDR, in which Humphrey died, and so it was the executors of his state that brought this up. But this is a very significant issue. And since I always like to mention a few of our liberal justices, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson argued that really Congress should do this because then you have nonpartisan experts working on certain issues for the good of the American people. Yes, well, can you read my little booklet on the deep state or read maybe the Friedrich Hayek book on the road to serfdom? Because even the editor said it's hard to find anyone in America who still believes in this fairy tale version of American bureaucracy. And then Justice Sonia Sotomayor is saying you're going to destroy the structure of government. Madam Justice, actually what they're trying to do is bring it back to the structure that was established by the founders of this country and the framers of the Constitution. I predict it will be ruling in favor of President Trump 6-3. But I could be wrong. But I want you to know that this is a different look at the same issue. The one we gave you on Friday was fearful that the court might rule in this case. This one is more recognizing this is what the Constitution would actually require. So I post it so that you can get a point, counterpoint. Look at the one on Friday, the one today. You can understand this issue about executive authority and whether or not these independent agencies should continue to always be as independent as they are. We'll take a break. We have a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Much has been written about the future impact of artificial intelligence, but today I would like to talk about how AI can be used against you. 3 types of AI scams are here, and you need to be prepared. The first is the deepfake video. These phony videos aren't just being used in social media to get us to laugh. They're already being used to influence you to do something that would cost you lots of money. Criminals can use AI to superimpose someone's likeness on a video. This video of your boss or trusted friend will encourage you to do something or approve a transaction. A second is AI voice cloning. AI just needs a few seconds of a person's voice to create a full digital replica. Then AI can mimic the voice that has the person's unique pitch, cadence, and inflection. It can even fake certain emotions. The voice could be an urgent plea from a child or grandchild. It could be a verbal order from your superior to transfer funds to a specific account. The third is phishing. We're all familiar with this weapon, but AI can make it more convincing. We know not to send money to the prince in Nigeria, but AI can write perfectly worded emails that also pull together detailed information from your social media profiles. No longer are these Dear Sir emails. They are personalized messages that look real and are engineered to seduce you into responding. How should we respond? One of my favorite phrases is trust but verify. In this case, don't even trust, but especially verify. Call back on another phone line. Check with a fellow worker. If contacted by a family member, ask for the family safe word. Be vigilant and discerning. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view on big data, go to viewpoints.info/data. That's viewpoints.info/data. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we're going to talk in just a few minutes with our good friend George Barna at the bottom of the hour. But let me just mention before we do so, my second article is from Larry Kudlow, and it's entitled The Affordability Crisis. Yes, we're back to that issue. And even if a minute ago you said, well, I really don't care about independent agencies, that's just something to worry about in Washington, D.C., I think you should worry about this issue of affordability because, number one, this economy needs to be affordable to you. Number two, it's going to have a very significant impact, I suspect, in terms of the midterm elections, as illustrated by the fact that President Trump is on a tour again, and it's called the Affordability Tour. Now, it's kind of interesting because the other day they were talking about the fact that, Donald Trump has kind of slowed down. Apparently, he fell asleep at a cabinet meeting, although I have not seen any evidence of that. But even if his eyes got heavy, that's understandable with a 3-hour cabinet meeting and a man that seemingly doesn't even know what it's like to get 8 hours sleep. But okay, let's give him some props and also recognize that if you were being concerned about the fitness of Joe Biden, okay, it's reasonable to ask about Donald Trump, although I think the two are in a very different category. But the other argument was, well, a good illustration of the fact that he is slowing down is he's not traveling as much. And I'm thinking, excuse me, he's been overseas, and of course here you have him right now traveling all through some of those very important swing states and some of those important congressional cases, really talking about affordability. But that being said, there is a need to do that because the drumbeat, which has existed since October at least, is that this has become unaffordable. And Donald Trump's response, gut response, which initially was, well, it's just a big hoax, he still sort of says that on the road, but the fact that he's doing an affordability tour is, I think, a recognition that you need to get some of the facts out there because don't expect the mainstream media, the legacy media, or even sometimes the conservative media to do your work for you. So that is certainly the case. And a good example of this is, of course, this piece by Larry Kudlow, who actually gives you some facts and figures I've not seen until I read his piece. And then number two, what I thought was so interesting is last night I got to see a short interview that somebody did with Stephen Moore. Now, Stephen Moore's been on the program with us before, an economist. He's been with the Wall Street Journal, now with the National Review. He's worked closely with the president on a number of things, and he rattled off a couple of facts and figures that I had not heard, and I think all of them need to be on the table so you can make a wise decision about this issue of affordability. And more importantly, I'm sure he's going to have some other positions in the future. As a matter of fact, one of the other people we quote quite often besides Stephen Moore, even when he's not on the program, is Kevin Hassett. And they're talking about Kevin Hassett being the next chairman of the Federal Reserve. So some of these people that we quote, some of these people who we post articles for, some of these people we've occasionally had a chance to interview may be in those positions as well. But here we go. Larry Kudlow said it may well be that there's an affordability crisis and consumers have no confidence in America on Donald Trump. Yet sometimes facts speak louder than political conjectures or biased polls, and he now gives you a few. For those of you who want to take some notes, get out your pen. He points out that on Black Friday, spending surged this year to new highs, fueled by record-breaking online spending that reached $11.8 billion on Black Friday alone. And so, again, the also prediction is during this entire holiday season, which starts on the day after Thanksgiving, Black Friday, to the end of this year, will probably be an all-time high, and you will have the biggest online spending in American history. And he says, of course, a lot of this is AI-driven. We're back to artificial intelligence again, aren't we? With artificial intelligence boosting traffic to online retail sites. Those referrals, by the way, popped 805%. More than 800% compared to last year. So when Donald Trump tells today's White House Economic Roundtable that he's inherited President Biden's problems, but he's fixing them, he does have a strong point. So the point he was making is that some of these numbers need to be put into context. And yesterday we talked a little bit about a comparison of Thanksgiving to Thanksgiving, and I gave you somebody who was more critical, obviously, of the president. Larry Kudlow is much more sympathetic to the president and goes on to say, here are some other facts worth considering. People worry about the labor market, but probably the best high-frequency indicator is initial unemployment claims, where the latest 4-week average has dropped all the way to 214,000. Now, again, recognize we'll never, I think, have full employment. And so when you have people filing unemployment, it's sad for any one individual, but you have to put that in perspective, which he does. He says, you know what's actually been following? The concern about a recession, because you would expect a recession, if you're having a real recession, of having what are called initial unemployment claims in the range of 350,000 or more. And this is much lower than that as well. He says, wait a minute, a couple more facts. He says wages are rising faster than prices. That's important because, as we've said, ever since we went off the gold standard in 1971, quite frankly, almost all the time, the prices have been going up faster than the wages. And so he gives you some figures there. And again, since it's radio, I'll let you read them because trying to follow a lot of numbers on air is sort of difficult. And then he also points out that people taking home their paychecks, home pay, is now ahead 2.6%. And that is going to increase dramatically, which was something Stephen Moore was talking about, that some of the things in what was called the Big Beautiful Bill that was passed last year, or the end of this year, if you want to think about how it was passed in terms of the fiscal year, is now only going to really begin to show up in 2026. But anyway, we digress. And then I thought it was kind of interesting because Larry Kudlow then talks about the cost of gas, which we did yesterday. And he says gas prices are below $3 a gallon across the country. Yes, but it's, depending on which state you're in, a little bit different. My engineer yesterday, Doug, sent me a picture today of what he paid for gas. I was going to show him the picture of what I paid for gas, and he found a better place. He actually saved 10 cents a gallon, better than I did, but I think his was $2.25 a gallon, which I think is pretty good. But nevertheless, again, these are examples of things that are in the news. You can dig them out and find them if you're looking for them, but they're not top-line summaries. They're certainly not in the headlines, and I think that is the case. And he points out that there's a very good reason why the price of gasoline has been going down because of, as he said, Donald Trump's policies of supply-side tax cuts, business deregulation, drill, baby, drill, fair and free reciprocal trade, and a number of others. And so the argument also is that they're seeing a jump in business construction for factories, machinery, and equipment. That's up more than 9% this year. And he said that's a big number, but you know what happens? You start up a factory, you order in new equipment and machinery, and then you hire people. But unemployment is so low that you're going to have to pay them a very decent wage. And so the point he's making is that when we look at some of these issues, affordability is an important one, and people tend to vote their pocketbooks. And if they feel like the economy is not doing well, they're going to say, well, what are you, meaning members of Congress, or what are you, Mr. President, going to do to fix it? As I've said before, there's only so much that a president or a Congress can do, many cases just stepping out of the way and letting the free enterprise system work. But oftentimes presidents take too much credit for good news and get too much blame for bad news. But nevertheless, this issue of affordability, it's going to be a big issue. So I would think for a lot of reasons, I would encourage you to maybe read this article, which we've posted on the website at pointofview.net. As you go there, you'll notice my Viewpoints commentary today is about these artificial intelligence scams, AI scams. I thought I would just let you know that there are some pretty sophisticated ones out there, and I would hate for any of our listeners to Point of View losing their money because they were in one way or another scammed by what looked like a real person talking to you, which are deep fake videos, or a real person that you know talking to you, which was AI voice cloning, or maybe phishing scandals, which are much more sophisticated. These aren't the Dear Sir emails. I think we all know not to send money to the Nigerian prince, but these will pull things from your social media profiles, say some things that look very convincing. And so I want, again, to remind you that as much as we love things like artificial intelligence, there are people that are now using AI in scams. And this is, if nothing else, sort of a public service announcement that's on my commentary today. You might want to read it, print it out. Educate yourself and your children with that. And let's take a break, and we'll talk with our good friend George Barna. That coming up right after this.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
One of the people we always depend on to give us good information and follow some of the very important trends in our society is George Barna. And the latest research survey from the Cultural Research Center describes the ongoing ideological and spiritual drift among Americans, and really even shows that consistent churchgoers are abandoning traditional biblical beliefs and even conservative social perspectives. lives, which reflect, as he says, a widening gap between Christian identity and biblical conviction. One example of that is a topic we address so often, and even a topic that's in my latest booklet on the road to serfdom, as well as, of course, we have another booklet on socialism, and even one that came out years ago on capitalism and socialism. So that, I think, illustrates the fact that we think this is an important issue, and obviously George Barna does as well. He is the Director of Research at the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University, also a professor there, also a Senior Research Fellow at the Family Research Council Center for Biblical Worldview. And George Barna, welcome back to Point of View.
Kerby, it's great to be with you again.
We are talking about a survey that had over 1,000 different regular churchgoers, commissioned by, again, the work that you do with the Cultural Research Center and our good friends at Family Research Council as well. And what you are seeing is just this spiritual and political drift in a point that at some respects we've seen for some time, but it's become even more significant, hasn't it?
Yeah, it really has. I mean, this is a continuation of a pattern that we've seen for a number of years. And in spite of the investment, a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of effort to try to get regular churchgoers, if nobody else, to really understand what the Bible teaches, what it has to do with our lives, how to make it real in our lives, we're seeing that there's been no gains. In fact, we're experiencing losses, not only in terms of beliefs, but also in terms of lifestyle practices. And so I think we've certainly passed that point where it's time for us to be asking ourselves, is it smart? Is it wise for us to continue to do the same things over and over and expect different results? Or maybe do we need to rethink the fact that the culture has changed dramatically? Ministry practices haven't. We never want to compromise scriptural truth, but the way that we get those into people's minds and hearts and lives may need to shift as a result of some of those cultural shifts.
Well, again, we've always talked about how we have fewer and fewer by percentage of individuals that have a worldview. And later on in your article, of course, you talk about you have a majority, but just a bare majority. 55% of churchgoers claim to have a worldview, but nearly half either do not or are unsure. And so that's of concern. And oftentimes we tend to focus on, well, then they don't necessarily believe the Bible. They don't believe in the deity of Jesus Christ. They maybe believe the Bible has errors in it, whatever it might be. And we'll get to some of those. But I thought what was so helpful about this one is we, as you well know, talk about some of these social, cultural, and political issues every day. Israel. Now, we yesterday had Dr. Paul Baraka in studio, and we talked about how there are some that are saying that Christian Zionism is a heresy and belief that Israel today is the same Israel as the past. So we went into all of that. But what you found is that it used to be quite typical, wouldn't you say, George, that the parents of some of these individuals you've interviewed, or in some cases even their grandparents, tended to have a very fond place in their hearts for Israel, and that's changed rather dramatically, hasn't it?
Well, it sure has. I just got back from Israel 2 days ago, and we spent a week there going all throughout the country, meeting with government officials, meeting with religious leaders, meeting with some of the hostages that have come back. And we learned a lot about the difficulties that Israel is sustaining and experiencing. And certainly when we look at the Christian body in America, one of the things that's become obvious is that they're taking their cues from the national media. And those cues often are anti-Semitic, or at least not in favor of the deeds of Israel. Certainly no understanding of the biblical realities of Israel and Judaism. And so, yeah, what we're finding right now is that there has been a shift within the Christian church with regard to its perspectives about Israel and Judaism and Jews. And part of that, of course, goes back to what you were alluding to earlier, that our study found that American Christians don't know if they have a worldview. If they do have a worldview, a lot of them don't know what it is. And when they look at their worldview, as far as they're concerned, it has nothing to do with Judaism and Israel. So there is this kind of lukewarm attitude at best that so many Christians in this country have in that regard.
Let's begin talk about socialism, and this one strikes heart very much because Gary Bauer a while back published a piece called "Jesus Wasn't a Socialist." So I, a couple of weeks ago, decided, well, I will quote from his column, and that one appeared to everybody on Friday. And I would have to say that our social media person will be able to testify if I brought her in here. We had a tsunami of really angry response to that, and it was coming obviously from anybody that saw the social media post. And of course, if you go out there on TikTok, or you go out there on X, or you go out there on Facebook, you're going to see it anyway. But even, I suspect, from the Christians. And you say in here, one of the survey's most striking findings concerns economics. Despite a plurality identifying as conservative, 1 in 3 churchgoers said they prefer socialism to capitalism, statistic that is unchanged since 2023, and only 46% reject socialism. So one of the reasons that years ago I did one on capitalism and socialism, this booklet I'm holding up right now for those of you watching online, was to address the issue, well, doesn't the Bible teach socialism rather than capitalism? Then I followed up with another one just on socialism to talk about all the concerns with it. And our most recent one, because I thought we need to talk about socialism again because of the election of various individuals who are socialist in places like New York City and Seattle. This Road to Serfdom is really a very important book, but I knew most people would not read a book by Friedrich Hayek, but they might read my booklet that talks about some of the dangers of it. And yet here again, I know that the typical pastor is not going to address the issues of free market, capitalism, socialism. But if all you're doing is getting your cues from the mainstream media, it's not surprising that we have a very significant number and increasing number of individuals that believe socialism is preferable to capitalism.
Yeah, and I think you can throw the public schools into that mix as well, where we know that so many of our schools are teaching young people that socialism is the better approach, that capitalism is old school, it doesn't work, it's lacking in compassion, and so on and so forth. And so in our current survey, I mean, what we found is that adults between the ages of 18 and 49, people under 50 basically, were more than twice as likely as people over that age to say that they prefer socialism. So when we say 32% of adults, it's closer to half of adults when you look at our younger adults, those who say that they would prefer that the U.S. move in that direction.
Again, I want to just maybe take a break and then get into some of the other aspects of biblical worldview. But since we mentioned socialism today, let me just once again remind you that we make those booklets available. Now, of course, one of the benefits is if you are actually a part of the Truth Team for $1 a day, $30 a month, or $360 a year, you'll receive these automatically. But if you say, well, I didn't get those in the past, or got them and I lost them, or I've never supported you, but I'd like to read them, you can go to our website, pointofview.net, and you scroll down and just go to the bottom where there's a search engine, and then you can type in a biblical view on socialism. It pops a PDF, which you can download right there. Biblical view on capitalism, socialism, that pops up as well. The one on Road to Serfdom is not up there yet, but that is certainly one that you can get in the future, and certainly is one of the benefits, as we've pointed out, for you to actually support this ministry. But while you go there, we also would encourage you to also scroll down past the picture of George Barna. First of all, we have a link to arizonachristian.edu, so you can know more about the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University. But if you go a little bit further down, you will see that we have this very significant summary, Churchgoers Tipping Towards Socialism, and it's the entire material related to Cultural Research Center. We have a little button there that says join their email list, so that if you'd like to receive these various emails that come out from Cultural Research Center, you can either use the button on his picture or the one on this article. And I would encourage you to do so because, as we'll find out when we come back from the break, this decline of a biblical worldview has lots of other consequences. We'll talk about that right after this.
listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
George Barna with us for a few more minutes. Again, he's with the Cultural Research Center. We have all sorts of information, which I would encourage you to get, and you can download some of that material. You can also sign up for their newsletter. And let's get back to this whole decline of a biblical worldview, because even though a majority of churchgoers claim they have a worldview, when you've done your American worldview inventory, George, you figure that probably it's more accurate to say about 11% of regular churchgoers possess a biblical worldview when you measure both their belief and behavior. So there are many more that think they are thinking biblically, but when you've begun to evaluate some of their beliefs and their subsequent behavior, that number drops off as well, doesn't it?
Well, that's absolutely true. And part of the reason is that so many regular churchgoers don't know what a worldview is, not even a biblical worldview. They just don't know what a worldview is. And so for them, they would say they have a biblical worldview if they believe that God existed, Jesus existed, the Holy Spirit exists. But of course, as the scriptures teach, even Satan believes that. And certainly he doesn't have a biblical worldview. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of lack of insight and education behind what's going on in the church.
Well, again, that reflects itself in, first of all, diminished moral clarity, and those are a lot of the issues we talk about here: abortion, religious liberty, marriage, whatever. But even for the listeners out there, maybe pastors saying, well, I'm not so concerned how they think about social issues, I just want to know what they think about the Bible. That's not great either, because you do have at least a majority of churchgoers, but just a bare majority of those who believe the Bible is true and inspired without error. But you have so many others that don't believe that it is without error, that it's flawed, that there are mistakes, and that is certainly not going to make it easy to develop a biblical world and life view, is it?
No, absolutely true. And, I mean, James teaches us that we're supposed to be doers of the word. And that's really what a worldview is all about. It's not just having the right beliefs for the sake of having the right beliefs. You want the right beliefs because we do what we believe. And so if you're going to do things that honor God, that advance his kingdom, that reflect the teachings of Christ, yeah, you've got to have the right beliefs, but then they've got to be put into practice. And so it's that whole aspect of behavior that's so critical. That's really the proving point of what your worldview is. A number of years ago, when I started measuring worldview like everybody else before me, I was just measuring beliefs, but then I realized, there's a big gap between what people have learned to say they believe and how they actually live. And so that's why we, maybe 20 years ago or so, I transitioned to, we not only have to measure beliefs, but also what kind of actions, behaviors, lifestyles should emanate from those beliefs. And so really a worldview is a combination of those two things.
Again, I love the fact that you break it down by percentages, by age, and all sorts of other issues. But let's see if we can talk about the practical aspect. One of the quotes in here from the material you have is from Dr. David Clausen, and he is, again, the director of the Center for a Biblical Worldview at the Family Research Council. But he said, again, just even apart from the issue of civic engagement, which we talk about so often here on Point of View, all these political, economic, and cultural issues, it also points to a growing gap in discipleship and theological understanding. And so the point is, we need to think about and maybe give some comments to our listeners. If you're a pastor, Sunday school teacher, life group leader, whatever it might be, on how you can pass these ideas on. Years ago, of course, you wrote a book. I think it was your 60th book, Raising Spiritual Champions. It's important to pass this on not only to the adults, but especially to this next generation, because it almost seems like the younger you are, the more likely you are to not have biblical beliefs, and thus not have biblical beliefs that apply to many of these social, political, and cultural issues we talk about here on Point of View.
Well, it's true, and part of the reason why children are so critical is because a person's worldview starts developing at about 15 months of age and typically is fully formed by the age of 13. So when most churches are saying, okay, now we're really going to start to focus in with our young adults, our middle-aged adults, we're going to get them on board with the right beliefs. Too late. They've already got a worldview in place. And we found, after a longitudinal study, tracked people's spiritual journeys for about 30 years. People's worldview typically doesn't change once it's been formed unless they go through a real dramatic crisis in their life. And even in most of those cases, their worldview doesn't change. So it's really critical that we focus on children because that's when the worldview is developed.
And it does seem to me that it comes back to one of the comments here that when half of the church-going adults say they don't even know if they have a worldview, it underscores how urgently pastors and parents must recommit to teaching biblical truth from the pulpit and around the dining room table. The answer to these trends is not despair, but to return to a faithful proclamation of God's Word. We must help Christians connect their zeal for God with a knowledge of God as Scripture commands in Romans 10:2. And so in some respects, we're really having this as a wake-up call for the church, but it should also be a wake-up call for parents. Certainly, you'll have to maybe choose what school you want to put your child in, but whatever school or educational program you have, as you said, we need to be teaching this around the dinner table, and we need to be teaching it from the pulpits, don't we?
We do. And I mean, if you go back to a passage like Deuteronomy 6, the Shema that talks about the fact that when you're working with worldview, this is not something that you put in 15 minutes a day and check it off the to-do list. This is an ongoing activity, so you do it around the table. You do it when you're out shopping. You do it when you're playing ball. You do it when you're in the classroom. You do it when you're spending time together at night as a family. Wherever and whenever you are, that's the time and the place to be refining and shaping and challenging the worldview of your children, everybody in the family, really, everybody in the church. And one of the things that really alarmed me out of the study is we saw a 12 percentage point drop in the number of regular churchgoers who even think it's very important for Christians to have a biblical worldview.
Mm-hmm.
They're not saying that they have one. They don't even think that it's important to have one. That number is dropping. And so, we've got to revisit this whole issue within our church bodies and make sure that people understand, look, if you want to be a disciple, that's about imitating Jesus. You can't imitate Jesus unless you can think like him, because your behavior is going to follow what you believe. And so worldview is really at the center of discipleship.
Well, again, if you'd like more information about this, first of all, we have a link to this particular article about how churchgoers are tipping towards socialism and a variety of other things. We also have a link to, again, the Cultural Research Center. You can go to arizonachristian.edu/Cultural Research Center, but you don't have to remember all that because we have the link there. There's a place where you can subscribe to get the latest updates from the Cultural Research Center. There is a way you can get on the email list. There are all sorts of things that are available. So, again, George Barna, thank you for doing the research, and as always, thank you so very much for being with us here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kirby. I love what you're doing. Keep doing it.
We are going to keep doing it, and as I think you figured out, why is the most recent booklet that landed in your mailbox on socialism? Well, it's because we can't even be sure that churchgoers aren't convinced that socialism is the answer to our economic woes in the future. We do have some answers. They're not found here. Of course, they're found in the Bible. And again, these booklets and many more that will come, and a lot of teaching which we will be doing, is because we have seen the evidence. And this latest survey from the Cultural Research Center and George Barna just underscores why we're doing what we do here on Point of View. By the way, if you value what they do, you might want to sign up for their mailing list. If you value what we do, you might click on that button that says donate. We would certainly appreciate your gift. We'll be right back.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in. Never give in. Never, 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 never yield to force. Never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend some time talking about Ukraine and, of course, all the things happening there, the humanitarian crisis, the winter is coming, and what we can do. And then we'll get back into some issues in the news. A very good piece by Victor Davis Hanson about immigration and really how that's starting to affect even legal immigration. So we'll get into that. Of course, the decision to maybe pause in immigrants from different countries and all sorts of other things we'll cover the last part of this hour. But first of all, to understand what's going on in Ukraine, can't think of a better person to go to than Michael Johnson, who is, of course, the president and is really built on this solid foundation of Peter Deinica and others at the Slavic Gospel Association. We have information about that. Matter of fact, we have updates on Ukraine and Israel that you can find on the website, pointofview.net, or you can go to sga.org and search around, but we've made it pretty easy for you. But first of all, Michael, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Kerby.
You know, I've failed to mention the fact that you really started out as an account manager. You're working at KMA. A lot of our listeners know Penna Dexter, and it was her husband, Todd Dexter, and you worked together. And I've always been so impressed with you for a variety of different reasons. We were just talking about the last time we got to see you face-to-face at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention, got to interview you. But here, as an account manager and an individual that could have spent your life with the advertising agencies, you took up the mantle there to run the Slavic Gospel Association, and I've always been very impressed with you, and so thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
Let's, if we can, talk about what it's like. I'm sure most of our listeners now are in the cold and recognizing it could be a more difficult winter. But imagine not having heat. Imagine not having electricity. Imagine if your church, fortunately, has a generator, so at least there's a place where you can get heat and hope. Talk about what's going on in Ukraine, because this is really a significant issue, and I wanted our listeners to know more.
Well, here's the thing. So the people in Ukraine are faced with problems on a number of fronts. Obviously, they find themselves in the middle of a war with Russia, and many people are suffering from just the fear of ongoing missiles and drones that are being fired at them from the Russians. And so, obviously that's creating a lot of fear and panic, and it's disrupting the economy, and it's basically disrupting their lives. But one of the problems is that the Russians have targeted their infrastructure. So they're blowing up their power plants and they're blowing up their heating facilities and so on and so forth. So a large percentage of the population in Ukraine do not have heat in their homes. So we created this program called Heat and Hope. Our friend Jim Killian, who you know is the one that came up with the line, he's really good at this kind of thing.
Yes.
And so we're connected to roughly 2,800 Baptist evangelical churches throughout Ukraine. And so we can get resources to them so that they can invite the people in their cities, towns, and villages to the churches, and they can get ministered to. So really, I mean, these people, they're getting up in the morning. They don't have any heat. They don't know where to turn. The economy's in collapse, and they need somebody that they can connect with. And so the churches, who now are sort of positioning themselves as centers of heat and hope, are offering their services to the people in their communities so that they can come, they can get warm, and if they need to spend the night, they'll spend a few days there with their families. They'll be ministered to both with the love of Christ, both physically and spiritually. And as a result of this, these people, every single person that goes into those churches, they hear a clear presentation of the gospel. Many people are repenting of their sins, coming to faith in Christ, and then coming back to the churches to be discipled. So the churches are really stepping out, and we have a strong connection with those churches. So the more resources we can get to them, whether it be material resources or financial resources, they can reach more people in their communities and share the love of Christ with them in the midst of this horrible war.
Let's, if we can, talk about the level there, because, first of all, in the remote villages, I might just point out that in some cases, all they can do is maybe pastors can meet some of the villagers as they're collecting wood or fuel for fire. But if you click on Give Now, I recognize that to buy, say, a generator for a church might be a bit more for some of our listeners, but it could be very easily something a church could put in its budget. But some of our listeners might be able to do that. But you break it down on what you can do to help one family, what you could do to help 4 families, what could be a possible purchase that a church could do. Just imagine what your world would be like right now if you did not have any kind of heat, electricity, any fuel, all sorts of things that you just take for granted. And power blackouts and bone-chilling temperatures are what these people face. And this is after a war that has been taking place around them, over their heads, and as a result is just a real need right now for some kind of outreach. So again, as you're reaching out to those individuals, are there some other things even churches can do? I know we can't necessarily send missionaries in there right now. It just seems to me that there's just a lot that desperately needs to be done, and certainly an agency that can channel that is be the Slavic Gospel Association.
Absolutely. And if those that are listening, if you're part of church leadership or if you're connected to church leadership, simply go to sga.org and then hit /heat and hope, and that'll lay it out to anybody that comes to the website in terms of what the resources are that you can be a part of, equipping those churches to be able to minister to the people in their communities. And again, there's a very strong spiritual component to this, because what we're finding in Ukraine is because of the acts of mercy of these local churches, many, many people are coming to faith in Christ. And there is a revival taking place in Ukraine. And what we're hearing is that the majority of the people who are attending these churches in Ukraine are either new Christians or new members of those churches because of the way in which they have demonstrated God's love to them during this difficult time.
Again, just to give people a perspective, we are talking about basically kind of Arctic conditions, because in January, minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe minus 50 degrees Celsius. Individuals are dying because of the cold, getting frostbite, all sorts of other issues. And this is a place where, certainly because of all that has taken place, it is a very significant region of the world that is ripe for, of course, the preaching and teaching of the gospel. But first, we need to minister to physical needs before we can even talk about ministering to some of the spiritual needs. So we're going to take a break and come back and chat a little bit more about some other things that you can do. We also encourage you to go to the website right now, because we have this link to Churches Ignite Hope as Ukraine Faces Weaponized Winter. But then there's also an update on Ukraine and Israel. And I thought, especially since yesterday we talked about Israel, we'd give you an update on some of the other things that SGA is doing as well. SGA.org, or simply go to pointofview.net. We have the links right there. And I would encourage you to be generous and to pray for the believers there in Ukraine. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Much has been written about the future impact of artificial intelligence, but today I would like to talk about how AI can be used against you. 3 types of AI scams are here, and you need to be prepared. The first is the deepfake video. These phony videos aren't just being used in social media to get us to laugh. They're already being used to influence you to do something that would cost you lots of money. Criminals can use AI to superimpose someone's likeness on a video. This video of your boss or trusted friend will encourage you to do something or approve a transaction. A second is AI voice cloning. AI just needs a few seconds of a person's voice to create a full digital replica. Then AI can mimic the voice that has the person's unique pitch, cadence, and inflection. It can even fake certain emotions. The voice could be an urgent plea from a child or grandchild. It could be a verbal order from your superior to transfer funds to a specific account. The third is phishing. We're all familiar with this weapon, but AI can make it more convincing. We know not to send money to the prince in Nigeria, but AI can write perfectly worded emails that also pull together detailed information from your social media profiles. No longer are these Dear Sir emails. They are personalized messages that look real and are engineered to seduce you into responding. How should we respond? One of my favorite phrases is trust but verify. In this case, don't even trust, but especially verify. Call back on another phone line. Check with a fellow worker. If contacted by a family member, ask for the family safe word. Be vigilant and discerning. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view on big data, go to viewpoints.info/data. That's viewpoints.info/data. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue your focus for a few more minutes on Ukraine, and in particular, a conversation with Michael Johnson, who is with the Slavic Gospel Association. We have a link there to sga.org, or you simply can follow the link on our website. Heat and Hope, very significant opportunity for you to give right now, but I thought we might broaden it for just a minute, Michael, and talk about the other things you've been doing over the years. For example, you have a way in which people can be involved with what is called a survival kit, food, clothing, scriptural materials, and things of that nature, which you have been making available. And that's just another outreach that you've had during this ongoing war.
Absolutely. And it's not only just the war, but it's just the fact that the conditions in this country are just so incredibly harsh. And we know that there's a conflict and a war between Russia and Ukraine, but we are still conducting a significant amount of ministry in Russia all throughout the country, particularly out in the Siberia region. And so, we're connected to the faithful churches there. They continue to preach the gospel. They continue to minister to people. They continue to lead people to faith in Christ. We're seeing a huge bit of a revival taking place in Russia as well during these times, because there's a lot of uncertainty. In the case of Russia, many many families have lost their husbands and their sons, and there's a lot of it's just been a really negative and very difficult set of circumstances that this war has caused on both sides of the conflict, and we continue to pray that this war ends. And so for us, our ministry is, we don't have missionaries over there. We're connected to the national churches. We equip those churches to reach out to the people in their communities, to lead people to faith in Christ, to disciple them in their churches. And we're heavily involved in theological training to the pastors and the leaders of those churches. And we're just seeing tremendous fruit with these godly Christians, many of whom are ministering in situations where there's a lot of opposition, and there's a lot of threats to them and their families, but they continue to minister and they continue to preach the gospel, and we're proud to be able to support them.
Well, that's one of the things I did want to talk about, because you have been equipping, I think it's 1,000 future leaders in Bible training, and that means that people can support you in that regard, whether it's training a student or equipping a pastor, a missionary, an evangelist, or something of that nature. That is something that has been kind of an ongoing work that you've been doing there because of the need to build up the next, if you will, structures and future of the church there in Ukraine. And I might just also mention around the areas, because many of these people in Ukraine have ended up in Poland, so there's also opportunities in other parts of the various countries to have that ministry as well, isn't there?
Oh yeah. The Ukrainian refugees that have left Ukraine and they've entered into Eastern Europe, they're having a tremendous impact, and there's a revival taking place in Poland and in those surrounding countries as well. Because Ukraine has always been considered the buckle of the Bible Belt throughout those countries, and that includes Western Europe. And these are godly people. These are faithful Christians. These are people that are consummate evangelists, and they're having a positive impact in the countries where many of them have been forced to move to. So God continues to work through the churches there, and we're just seeing tremendous results.
Let me just real quickly, since we did talk about Ukraine, just for a second, focus on Israel. Yesterday we had Dr. Paul Baraka in here, and we were talking about the issue of Israel, and some people saying, well, Israel no longer has the promises that are given in the Old Testament. We tried to answer all of those questions and spent a fair amount of time talking about Israel. Of course, he's got another trip going to Israel. But you've also, because we've had, of course, all the things happening with not only a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, you've also been very much involved because of the conflict between Israel and Hamas. And so you've had even an Israeli emergency fund, because you even have some of the Ukrainian and Russian-speaking Jewish evangelical churches that you actually serve, actually have been involved in one way or another with what's going on in Israel.
Absolutely. And it's estimated that roughly, 20 to 25% of the population in Israel are either Russian or Russian-speaking, Ukrainian or Ukrainian-speaking, because, as many people know, there's been a significant influx of immigrants from Russia and Ukraine, with Russian and Ukrainian Jews wanting to repatriate to their homeland. And so we're seeing a significant growth in that particular population, and we're connected to a network of Baptist evangelical churches in Israel that are populated by completed Jews in Israel. And so we serve and equip them through Bible training and sponsorship and humanitarian aid resources and so on and so forth, so that they can conduct and expand their ministries throughout Israel. Because what I am told that it's the Russian and Ukrainian immigrants in Israel that are the most open to the gospel, because they come out of atheistic homes.
Yes.
And so they're kind of a blank slate, if you will. So they're a lot more open to respond to the gospel, come to faith in Christ, and then plug themselves into these churches.
So again, one more time, I wanted to encourage people to visit the website, and it is sga.org, and there's a place for you, maybe if you wanted to help a family or a couple of families, or a generator for a church, which is, again, not out of the reach of some individuals listening to this broadcast, but certainly something which is very much within the reach of churches. And so, Michael, if people would want to contact you, maybe a church leader or a person that was wanting to maybe know more about this, or maybe have you come and speak for their missions outreach or something of that nature, how can they contact you, and what would be available for some of the churches if they would like to jump onto some of the projects we've been talking about?
Well, again, you can always reach us through the website. The contact information is there. But we have an 800 number. It's 1-800-BIBLE-50. That's 1-800-BIBLE-50. And if you want to give us a call and ask to talk to me, I'm always available to talk to pastors and other Christian leaders.
So again, I would encourage you to visit the website. That's the first step. Then you can find some of the links we have there. We also mentioned one for Ukraine, one for Israel, and of course all the outreach there as well. As you click on there, you're going to find out, as we just mentioned a minute ago, all sorts of ministry. We've talked about getting some of the literature, the spiritual literature out there, the Bible material out there, equipping 1,000 future pastors and training them. Some of the outreaches they're doing, even with street evangelism, places like Poland and other places. And so it's a ministry you need to know about, and Slavic Gospel Association has been in existence ever since Peter Dyneka began it many, many years ago. So, as always, Michael, thank you for being with us today on the program, and let me encourage our listeners to take some of this material that we are making available on our website, put it to good use, and to be generous with their gifts.
Thanks, Kerby. I appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you at NRB this year.
We'll see what we can do. Let's see if we can take a break and mention again some of the resources that we have. A couple of things that I might point you to. First of all, of course, the various interview material we've talked about so far. We talked about whether or not the independent agencies are really independent. That one relates to a very important Supreme Court case, the Larry Kudlow piece on affordability, which we will come back to even on Friday. I know we have a piece that we'll be talking about related to that as well. Of course, the George Barna piece about what we are facing right now in terms of a declining biblical worldview, even inside our churches, and how that has manifested itself in a variety of different ways. And then, of course, the material that we have here by Michael Johnson on churches in Ukraine, and a number of other links that you probably want to take advantage of there as well. As we take a break, let me again mention that we do have a lot of information available to you to take advantage of. We, of course, make available these booklets and other resources. So if you are not supporting Point of View, we would certainly like to get those in your hands. Whether you support us or not, let me mention that we have our Pray for America sign up. The most recent one I just signed off on today will be going out shortly, dealing with the issue of anti-Semitism, which we talked about yesterday. So that's free to sign up, and you can subscribe to that. You can also, of course, subscribe to the Viewpoints commentary. Mine today is on AI scams, but each day we send you, Monday through Friday, one of my commentaries. On Saturday, you receive Penn Extra's commentary. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to listen to some of this again, but I don't have 2 hours, we have a Point of View highlights, which is on Spotify. And so Megan takes the time to shorten those in a way that will be easy for you to consume. And so there are all sorts of buttons that you can click on the website to help you find some of this information, because we want to equip you and encourage you and empower you to make a difference. We're going to take a break, come back and talk about this issue of immigration right after this.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. You know, that scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, let's, if we can, get into this issue of immigration. And I've actually titled this article, Legal Immigration Backlash, because what you will find out is because we've had open borders and we've just had this number of millions of people crossing the border illegally, you're now starting to see a backlash to legal immigration, and that is sometimes what we refer to in politics as unintended consequences. But to get into this, I will use as sort of a structure this article by Victor Davis Hanson, which goes on for about 4 pages. But in between, I'm going to pull some things from this latest article in the New York Times, another series of commentaries that have come out by a couple of individuals that are columnists, a piece by The Spectator, and much, much more. So in some respects, the only article I've posted is the Victor Davis Hanson one, which I would encourage you to read, because even as I go through it, I will summarize it, and there is more to be covered. But he points out that it is hard now, even for Democrats, to defend illegal immigration, given that the Biden administration allowed in more than 10 million entrants. Among these were an estimated 500,000 criminals. No one believes that was wise and should ever be repeated. Now, what I think is kind of interesting is that is not an extreme statement. As a matter of fact, a piece that we will talk about in more detail on Friday was, isn't it amazing now that even the New York Times is writing pieces about the disastrous lack of any kind of enforcement of our border. So I'll hold up this piece right here from the New York Times. And of course, those of you that read the New York Times can read it in its entirety. But the title is How Biden Ignored Warnings and Lost Americans' Faith in Immigration. And the subtitle says the Democratic president and his top advisors rejected recommendations that could have eased the border crisis that helped return Donald Trump to the White House. Again, I think Donald Trump was headed to the White House whether or not immigration was there, but yes, that's maybe one reason. And here it's kind of interesting because the writers in the New York Times said, in the weeks after Joe Biden was elected president, advisors delivered a warning. His approach to immigration could prove disastrous. Mr. Biden had pledged to treat unauthorized immigrants more humanely than President Trump, who generated widespread backlash by separating migrant children from their parents. And again, you're getting the New York Times bias and all that, but we'll leave it as it is. But Joe Biden was now president-elect, and his position threatened to drastically increase border crossings. Experts advising his transition team warned in a Zoom briefing in the final weeks of 2020, according to people with direct knowledge of that briefing, that jump, they said, could provoke a political crisis. And chaos was the word that the advisors used. Now, again, in some respects, you're saying this is old news. Yeah, it's old news, but it's in the New York Times yesterday. So you get the point. Now they're coming to realize the things we were talking about back then and all through the 4 years that Joe Biden was president. But the fact that it shows up in the New York Times, I think, illustrates that this was not something that was well received and was one of the things, and they suspect maybe the major thing, I think that's a little overplayed, that caused Donald Trump to be reelected as president. But nevertheless, If I go back to Victor Davis Hanson, he talks about the fact that we had really no ICE control. We had no border patrol that was taking seriously returning people back. And so he said the world's poor, sick, and both law-abiding and criminal, young and old, understood that anyone could now enter the U.S. at will. Deterrence, he says, and legality was lost. He said in its place, the message went out that if it were permissible to cross the border unlawfully, then by extension, it would be seen as equally fine to reside illegally as well, and perhaps further ignore laws on the theory that the host had sanctioned all such exemptions. And that's the argument he's making. Once you can break that law, people began to think they could break every other law, but we'll get to that in due course. Now, he also points out one of the great ironies. He says, during the lockdown hysteria, some 8,000 to 8,500 U.S. soldiers were expelled from the military for refusing the experimental RNA vaccine. As a matter of fact, just a few miles from where this broadcast is today here in Dallas, they're having another session of the National Religious Liberty Commission, and they're focusing on the military, and one or two of the testimonies are about how these people were mistreated because they refused to take the vaccine. Then he also goes on that not only were soldiers expelled from the military, state employees nationwide were being fired for refusing the government vaccines. But nevertheless, he says, illegal aliens would have no such mandates or worries. They simply walked in without worries over vaccinations and even their current COVID status, and surmised correctly that illegal aliens were part of a Biden administration protected and privileged category. So he does for a minute delve into why did President Biden do this? And he has at least four possible explanations. Number one, whereas the Biden handlers plan for more poor to grow the welfare state and expand liberal government. Number two, was it misplaced idealism to welcome in millions of the world's poorest who would then soon make it even more difficult for the nation's citizen poor to find affordable housing and health care, he says. Number three, was the agenda to create future dependencies and constituencies for an otherwise ossified Democratic Party? I think that's certainly one of those. And number four, or was it in an effort to ensure in DEI terms that the oppressed and victimized would outgrow the inert white oppressors and victimizers? And even though he says 1, 2, 3, and 4, I think it could be all four, although some more than others. What he said is that oddest of all was the attitude of the left toward the past destruction of the border. They went mum, or in other words, they were quiet about the rampant illegality as the border disappeared and as millions filtered through the nation. Americans had no idea who the newcomers were or even where or why they were here. And so he goes on to say that after assuming the law did not apply to illegal alien entrants, they now insist in full force that we now must apply those same laws to the 10 million aliens who came here and are now being sent home. So he points out lots of ironies, not the least of which the irony which we mentioned just a minute ago about the fact that we required everybody from the military to government employees to get a vaccine, and anybody did not would lose their job, and no such requirements were ever foisted upon those coming across the border. And now the other irony of those who seem to not care about the rule of law when we allowed all sorts of people to just walk across our border, overstay their visas, get off of boats. And now they want the rule of law applied to every one of those individuals who came here illegally in the first place. So he said the result, however, has been a massive, if you will, nullification of immigration laws, and has been the nation's outrage over illegal immigration, which is now extended, he says, to legal immigration as well. Because of this current level of frustration, all legal immigration will likely soon be put on hold. And if you go, for example, to USA Today, you'll see a story of some naturalized citizens who are simply going to give their allegiance to the United States, to raise their right hand and actually pledged their oath to the United States, and some of them were interrupted by ICE because they are coming from some of those banned countries. And so now you have individuals that have come through legal immigration who are facing some kind of interruption. I think it's just a pause. And then, of course, you have other people wanting to come to this country through legal immigration, but because we are stuffed to the gills because we have so many people here illegally, the issue of illegal immigration has now actually had a detrimental impact on legal immigration. So we'll talk about why that is the case after the break, because that's the second part of the piece by Victor Davis Hanson. And then we'll get into, of course, some of the reasons why the Trump administration has called, for example, a pause from Afghanistan in light of the shooting of the two particular National Guards individuals. And so we'll get into some of that in just a minute. But I think Victor Davis Hanson has helped us understand that what started out as a lack of enforcement on the border has increased the amount of crime in this country, but it also has had a detrimental impact on legal immigration. And he gives us 3 reasons why, which we'll talk about right after the break. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Let's continue for just a few more minutes on this issue of immigration, because, again, I think Victor Davis Hanson has stumbled onto something, or maybe logically concluded it, however you want to say that. But why is it, when we've had such a rush of illegal immigration, that we've had now such a pushback and, if you will, almost a backlash against legal immigration? And he gives us at least 3 reasons. The first is we are currently in a great experiment. Never has the U.S. foreign-born resident population approached 50 to 55 million, or 16% of the population. There is something to be said about the coherent nature of a country, and many countries which have been very homogeneity, have a great deal of homogeneity or homogeneous, however you want to say it, whether it's been Norway and all the various individuals that have come there that are Muslims, whether it's been Japan or a variety of others. And we as a country have always been a melting pot country, but we assume that eventually the pot does melt. In other words, you eventually assimilate, and that is very doubtful when at least 16% of your population wasn't born here. And so they are bringing with them, as we've already pointed out in other programs, all sorts of attitudes, values, back to the conversation we had with George Barna, worldviews, which are not necessarily always helpful to building up the United States of America. So that's his first point. His second one is, never has the once-time tried melting pot creed of assimilation, integration, and acculturation been under greater assault and ridicule just when it's needed. Because it used to be that, well, yes, you're Polish and you're a Polish American, but by the time your children become Americans, they might have a Polish name, but they are definitely fully Americans. And the same thing if you are German Americans, or even people coming here from other countries where the language and even the facial characteristics are different, whether you come from Africa or Asia, whatever it might be. But because we've had this DEI mindset for so long, the idea of trying to have people assimilate to our culture is really under attack right now, because the argument is, why do we want them to agree with the values of America, since that was instituted by white supremacists and all sorts of other arguments that are made? And so as a result, it's very difficult to even talk about assimilation, because the argument is we shouldn't always require people to be assimilated. And so we start talking about balkanization and things of that nature. So those are the first 2 points. But the third one is one that he also mentioned earlier, but is really significant. He says if millions of legal immigrants are not asked to assume fully American identities, and further, if they feel that they are exemptions, right? Remember, they didn't have to get the vaccine, and the largesse that they're receiving, all the benefits, welfare benefits and things like that, actually then reinforce their tribal status and even maybe their victimization status. So then they will feel that they're really not subject to any of the laws or even customs of America. And I think he's got a good point there. Instead, immigrants under these new protocols will seek to carve out their own tribal communities, and based on ethnic chauvinism, maybe even an idea that they have an exemption from accountability. If this sounds familiar, a paragraph later, he then spends some time talking about the logical result of such tribal immigration is now upon us. Somali immigrants, both legal and illegal, have pulled off a likely multi-billion-dollar welfare fraud in Minnesota, perhaps the greatest single heist in the nation's history concerning welfare fraud and funds. They were empowered by the usual DEI boilerplate rhetoric from such people as Representative Ilhan Omar, who has actually claimed that America is now one of the worst countries in the world, Governor Tim Walz, and even the Attorney General there, Keith Ellison. And so he says more criminality, theft, and fraud were uncovered, the more Somali leadership screamed racism, with the Democratic individuals, enablers basically, blaming everyone but the perpetrators themselves. He says, meanwhile, since he lives in California, Victor Davis Hanson says in California has issued at least 17,000 commercial driver's licenses to illegal alien truck drivers, the majority of them non-residents with little, if any, prior trucking experience or English facility. The result is a sort of road warrior new atmosphere on the nation's freeways as a new generation of truckers ignores the norms of the past and rightly concludes that if they were given exemption to enter the United States illegally and further to drive without proper audits, then naturally no authorities would mind if they violated American traffic laws. And if you've been out on the road, and I am on the road all the time, either going to speaking at different groups or even making my way to this studio, I have always assumed when I'm near truckers that they're going to probably be some of the best drivers because they've been doing it for so long. But lately, I've seen some drivers doing some remarkably outrageous things with their rigs, which, first of all, reflects poorly on those responsible truck drivers. But number two, I think is an illustration of the fact that it really has become almost a road warrior out there on some of the freeways. So then the final points he makes are, then, of course, we also have allowed 1 million foreign students into the United States, the majority from China, India, and the Middle East. But we began to notice, especially the ones from the Middle East, even though they were guests, they openly cheered Hamas, and even though they're non-citizens, declared campus areas no-go zones for many of these American Jews. And so he's talking about all the impact that this has had as well. And so as for the millions who cross the southern border almost daily, a national news story relates a DUI driver has killed an American family, or a U.S. citizen has been murdered or raped, or a so-called undocumented immigrant, usually with a criminal record and several deportations, has been guilty of some of that. And the net result has been recent generations of immigrants have done the impossible, turned the most generous nation in the world from being one of the most welcoming to increasingly resistant to mass immigration of any sort. And so as a result, what we've seen is whereas before we were a welcoming country, now there is a real question not only about illegal immigration, but there is quite a backlash brewing about legal immigration. And so as a result, the more we read stories of too many horrendous semi-truck accidents, too many horrific murders, too many anti-Semitic screams, too many abuses of a generous welfare state, the American people are starting to rethink even the issue of immigration that's being done legally. And I think, again, it's a good illustration of an unexpected consequence, but if you think it through logically, I think it makes a great deal of sense. That's all we have for today. Of course, we're going to have our Next Generation Roundtable tomorrow. We'll hear some of the comments that they have, and then on Friday, we have our weekend edition. This will be an opportunity to talk with Dr. Merrill Matthews and Holly Randall, so we look forward to that as well. Most importantly, I always like to thank Megan, who is back from Florida, a short trip to go to a wedding and a few other things, so we missed you. And Megan, thank you for engineering the program. Steve, thank you for always being here for us as the producer. And most importantly, we thank you for joining us here on Point of View. Visit the website, find some of these articles, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.